History remembers him as a military genius, an enlightened monarch, the architect of modern Germany. But behind the trophies and titles lies a buried secret, a forbidden love and a soul crushed beneath the heel of his own father. He was a prince who loved poetry, music, and a man. His name was Frederick. And the truth of who he was does not lie on the battlefield, but on a horrific morning when he was forced to watch the man he loved beheaded, executed simply for loving him. The man who ordered that execution was his father, Frederick William I, the King of Prussia, history's so-called soldier king, a title both accurate and terrifying. To him, the world was a barracks, and men were either soldiers or worthless. Art, music, French poetry, these were not marks of refinement, but of weakness. Where the father worshipped the army, the son worshipped beauty. And in that war between iron and the soul, the casualty was always Frederick. From the very beginning, the boy was a profound disappointment to his father. Where the king was blunt and practical, Fritz was sensitive and imaginative. Fritz was, by all accounts, a gifted child. He was quick-witted, possessed a sharp intellect, and had an insatiable appetite for knowledge. He learned to read and write in French and German, devoured classical literature, and became deeply enamored with the radical new ideas sweeping across Europe, the Enlightenment. He corresponded with great thinkers, dreaming of a world governed by reason, tolerance, and justice. In secret, he adorned himself in fine French silks, wrote poetry, and poured his soul into his flute. His tutors, brought in to shape him into a soldier, instead found themselves nurturing a philosopher. To his father, this was nothing short of a catastrophe. It was a perversion of nature, a betrayal of his Prussian bloodline. He saw his son's artistic passions not as talents, but as symptoms of an effeminate, degenerate character. The soldier king wanted an heir who was a carbon copy of himself, a pious, frugal, military-obsessed brute. What he got was a poet. The clash was inevitable, and it was brutal. The royal palace was not a home. It was a psychological war zone. Frederick William's methods for curing his son of his intellectual and artistic leanings were nothing short of sadistic. He would publicly humiliate Fritz, calling him an effeminate puppy in front of the entire court. He would burst into his son's rooms, searching for contraband, French books, musical scores, elegant clothes, and, upon finding them, would hurl them into the fireplace with a roar of fury. His sister, Wilhelmina, who was Frederick's closest confidant and ally, later wrote about these years with harrowing clarity. She described how their father would fly into rages, often for the slightest perceived infraction. He would beat both of them, pulling them by the hair, his fists raining down blows. On one notorious occasion, the king discovered that Fritz was secretly taking Latin lessons. He flew into such a rage that he attacked the tutor with his cane and then turned on his son, dragging him across the room and beating him until he was forced to intervene. The king forced Fritz to watch military exercises for hours on end in the freezing cold or blistering heat. He dictated every aspect of his life, from the coarse, simple food he was allowed to eat to the plain, military-style clothes he was forced to wear. But the more pressure the king applied, the more Frederick retreated into his secret world. The abuse didn't make him a soldier. It made him a master of deception. He learned to wear a mask of obedience while his inner life grew richer and more defiant. His love for philosophy wasn't just an interest anymore. It was an act of rebellion. His flute wasn't just an instrument. It was a weapon against his father's tyranny. It was in this crucible of fear and defiance that Frederick developed a deep-seated cynicism about authority and a profound longing for a life of freedom, a life where he could simply be himself. In this oppressive darkness, a single beacon of light appeared. His name was Hans Hermann von Katte. A lieutenant in the Prussian army, Katte was a few years older than Frederick. He was everything the prince's father was not: sophisticated, witty, and deeply cultured. He was from a well-respected military family, which gave him access to the court, but his heart was more aligned with the arts and philosophy. He played the lute, read French poetry, and could converse with Frederick on an intellectual level that no one else could. Their connection was immediate and profound, filled with passion, devotion, and a sense of shared rebellion. With him, Frederick could finally lower his guard. He could speak openly about his frustrations, his dreams, and his love for the Enlightenment, without fear of ridicule or punishment. Katte didn't see an effeminate failure. He saw a brilliant, sensitive young man trapped in an impossible situation. For the first time in his life, Fritz felt seen, understood, and accepted. The exact nature of their relationship has been debated by historians for centuries, largely because any explicit evidence would have been incredibly dangerous to preserve. In 18th century Prussia, homosexual acts were a crime punishable by death. But reading between the lines of contemporary accounts and looking at the sheer intensity of their bond, it is difficult to see it as a simple friendship. Their connection was filled with the passion, devotion, and emotional dependency that characterize a great love affair. Katte became Frederick's confidant, his partner in intellectual rebellion, and believed to be his lover. He was the one person in the world with whom Frederick could share both his mind and his heart. This secret relationship became the center of Frederick's universe. It was a source of immense joy and comfort, but it was also a source of immense danger. They were playing with fire in a court ruled by a man who saw any deviation from his rigid norms as treason. As Frederick's desperation to escape his father's control grew, so too did his reliance on Katte. The two began to dream of a future together, far away from the stifling atmosphere of Berlin, perhaps in England, where Frederick's maternal relatives, the Hanoverians, held the throne. A life of freedom, music, and philosophy seemed within reach. By the summer of 1730, the situation had reached a breaking point. Frederick was now 18 years old, and his father's tyranny had become unbearable. The king was trying to force him into a marriage with an Austrian archduchess, a political alliance that Frederick found repulsive. The daily beatings and humiliations continued unabated. The gilded cage had become a torture chamber. Frederick decided he could endure it no longer. A plan, desperate and fraught with peril, began to form in his mind. He would flee. He would desert his post as a colonel in the Prussian army and escape to England. And he would not go alone. He confided in Katte, who, despite recognizing the immense risks, pledged his loyalty. Their shared dream was about to become a desperate gamble, a bid for freedom that would pit them against one of the most ruthless monarchs in Europe. They knew the danger, but what they couldn't possibly have imagined was the horrifying price that one of them would pay for their love and their defiance. The die was cast. In the late summer of 1730, Crown Prince Frederick was traveling with his father and a large royal entourage through southern Germany. This was not a leisurely tour, it was a military inspection, and the atmosphere, as always, was thick with the soldier king's oppressive authority. But for Frederick, this journey represented something else entirely: a fleeting, desperate chance at freedom. The plan, hatched in hushed tones and coded letters with Katte and a few other trusted confidants, was as simple as it was audacious. At an agreed-upon point near the French border, Frederick would slip away from the royal party under the cover of darkness, rendezvous with an accomplice, and race for the safety of France and then on to England. Every detail was meticulously, if naively, planned. horses were arranged. A coded message, "I have departed from Potsdam," would be sent to Katte back in Berlin, signaling him to flee and meet Frederick abroad. Another young officer, Lieutenant Keith, who was also party to the plot, was waiting nearby to aid the prince's flight. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it must have seemed possible. The weight of his father's tyranny, the endless drills, the public humiliations, the threat of a loveless political marriage, all of it could be left behind on a dusty German road. Ahead lay a life of the mind, of music, and of love, with the one person who truly understood him. But a gilded cage, no matter how large, is still a cage. And Frederick William I was a vigilant, paranoid jailer. He had long suspected his son's rebellious spirit, and his spies were everywhere. The prince was being watched, his every move scrutinized. The plan began to unravel almost before it began. One of the accomplices, having lost his nerve, confessed parts of the plot. A panicked, incriminating letter from Frederick to Katte was intercepted. The king now had the proof he needed. The trap was about to spring. On the morning of August 5th, 1730, in a small village near Mannheim, Frederick's desperate bid for freedom came to a brutal end. As he made his final preparations to slip away before dawn, he was discovered. His father, alerted by his spies, was waiting. What followed was not a quiet arrest, but a scene of terrifying violence. Frederick William, his face contorted with a rage that bordered on madness, descended upon his son. He didn't speak. He roared. He tore at Frederick's hair and struck him. Eyewitnesses reported that the king, in his fury, drew his sword and may well have killed his own son on the spot, had one of his generals not thrown himself between them, crying out, "Sire, you can kill me, but spare your son." Frederick, a crown prince of a European kingdom, was treated like a common criminal. He was stripped of his sword and his military decorations, his fine clothes torn from his back. He was now officially a prisoner, a deserter, a traitor to his king, and more damningly, to his father. Back in Berlin, news of the prince's capture spread like wildfire. Katte received an urgent warning from a friend. Flee, flee now, while you still can. For a moment, his fate hung in the balance. He could have escaped, he could have saved himself. But his thoughts were not for his own safety. They were for Frederick. He knew they had exchanged countless letters. Letters filled with philosophical musings, complaints against the king, and, no doubt, declarations of their deep affection. To leave them behind would be to hand the king a trove of evidence that would condemn the prince. So, Katte made a fateful decision. Instead of running, he spent precious hours gathering their correspondence, frantically burning the papers that could incriminate the man he loved. It was an act of profound loyalty, but it was also a fatal mistake. By the time he had finished, it was too late. The king's soldiers were at his door. He was arrested and dragged away in chains. His act of love had sealed his doom. Frederick was transported to the fortress of Küstrin, a bleak, forbidding citadel on the Oder River. He was thrown into a dungeon-like cell, stripped of all comforts. He was denied books, denied his flute, denied even a proper bed. He was given a coarse prisoner's uniform and fed meager rations. The soldier king's vengeance was not just about punishment, it was about systematic degradation. He wanted to utterly break his son, to humiliate him, to strip away every last vestige of the philosopher prince and leave only a terrified, obedient subject. An interrogation began, led by a ruthless military tribunal handpicked by the king. Frederick was accused of the highest crimes: treason and desertion from the army in wartime, a state of perpetual readiness that Frederick William always maintained. The penalty for both was death. The king made it chillingly clear what he wanted. He spoke openly of executing his own son, declaring, It is better that he should die than that justice should be removed from the world. He seemed to relish the prospect, viewing it as a righteous act, a necessary amputation to save the honor of his kingdom and his family. A court-martial was convened, a show trial designed to produce one outcome. Both Frederick and Cotta were put on trial for their lives. The evidence, much of it extracted under duress, was damning. Frederick, facing his own mortality, initially tried to protect Cotta, taking the blame upon himself, but under relentless pressure, he eventually broke, his testimony further implicating his friend. The judges, all high-ranking officers, found themselves in an impossible position. To condemn the crown prince, the heir to the throne, to death was an almost unthinkable act. It violated every tradition of monarchy. After much deliberation, they delivered their verdict. They found Frederick guilty, but citing their inability to sentence the crown prince without the king's explicit command, they effectively threw themselves on the king's mercy, begging him to pardon his son. Their verdict on Cotta was more straightforward. They found him guilty of treason, but considering his confession and his noble family background, they sentenced him not to death, but to life imprisonment in a fortress. It was a harsh sentence, but it was not the ultimate one. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that Cotta might be spared the executioner's axe. When the king received the court-martial's verdict, he erupted in one of the most terrifying rages of his life. He saw the sentence of life imprisonment not as justice, but as a cowardly betrayal by his own officers. They had failed him. In his mind, Cotta was not just a traitor. He was the seducer, the corrupting influence who had poisoned his son's mind and soul. He deserved not mercy, but an exemplary punishment, a spectacle of horror that would serve as a permanent warning to any who dared defy him. So Frederick William I, in an act of absolute tyrannical power, took a pen and personally struck out the court sentence. He overruled his own judges, his own laws, and his own officers. Beside Cotta's name, he wrote a new sentence: not life in prison, death by beheading. But the king's cruelty had not yet reached its apex. It wasn't enough for Cotta to die. Frederick had to suffer. He had to be made to watch, to feel every ounce of the pain his rebellion had caused. The king issued a new set of orders, each one more sadistic than the last. Cotta was not to be executed in Berlin, where he was being held. He was to be transported to the fortress of Kustrin. The execution was to be carried out there. And the crown prince, his son, was to be held at the window of his cell, forced to witness the beheading of the man he loved. The stage was now set for the final act of this tragedy. Frederick, alone in his cold cell, was informed of the verdict. His friend, his confidant, his beloved Cotta, was going to die. And he, the prince for whom Cotta had risked everything, would be powerless to stop it. He would be nothing more than a spectator at the destruction of his own world. The sensitive boy who loved poetry and music was about to be subjected to a lesson in power so brutal, so absolute, that it would extinguish the light within him forever, and in its place, forge the cold, hard steel of a king. The news of Cotta's death sentence, and the king's monstrous command that Frederick be forced to watch, did not just break the prince's heart, it shattered his reality. In the final hours leading up to the execution, he descended into a state of frantic despair. He pleaded, he begged, he wrote desperate, rambling letters to his father, letters that were likely never delivered. He offered to renounce the throne, to accept exile, to do anything, if it would spare Cotta's life. His pleas fell on the deaf ears of stone walls and a father whose heart had long since turned to granite. For Hans Hermann von Cotta, His final night on earth was a study in remarkable composure. He had been a soldier, and he would face death like one. He was granted permission to write letters, and he spent the night pouring out his final thoughts. He wrote to his grandfather, expressing regret for the dishonor he had brought upon his family, but maintaining the quiet dignity of a man who had made his peace with his fate. He wrote to his father a heartbreakingly tender letter, asking for forgiveness and entrusting his soul to God. He made no attempt to blame Frederick. There was no bitterness, only a profound, tragic acceptance. In his final hours, his concern was not for himself, but for the grief of his family and the torment of his prince. There was one last, desperate attempt at contact. Frederick managed to get a message smuggled to Kata, a frantic plea for forgiveness. "My dear Kata," he wrote, "I curse the day and the hour that I was born. I have been the cause of your death, and that of many other brave knights. If I had 1,000 lives, I would give them all for yours." Kata's reply, smuggled back to the prince, was an act of supreme grace and love. He told Frederick there was nothing to forgive. He spoke of the sweetness of dying for someone he loved so dearly. He urged the prince to submit to the will of the king and to find peace with God. It was a final absolution, a last gift from a man walking toward his own death, intended to soothe the soul of the man he was leaving behind. But it could offer no comfort. There could be no comfort. There was only the cold, creeping dread of the dawn. The morning of November 6, 1730 arrived with a chilling finality. The fortress of Kustrin was shrouded in a damp, cold fog. Frederick, who had not slept, was roused by his guards. They did not need to tell him what was happening. He could hear it. The sounds of a small crowd gathering in the courtyard below, the low, muffled voices of officials, and then the unmistakable rhythmic thud of hammers on wood, the sound of the scaffold being erected directly opposite his window. His jailers informed him of the king's order. He was to be forcibly held at the window. There was no escape. 2 guards entered his cell, their faces grim. They took up positions on either side of him. The prince, pale and trembling, was paralyzed by a grief so profound it was beyond tears. His mind, the brilliant philosophical mind that had once debated the nature of justice and reason, was now trapped in a singular, horrifying reality. He was about to become an unwilling witness to a murder sanctioned by the state, orchestrated by his own father, and starring the person he held dearest in the world. Then he saw him. Hans Hermann von Katte was led into the courtyard. He was dressed in a simple brown suit, his hands bound, but he walked with his head held high, his bearing calm and resolute. He did not look like a man about to die. He looked like a nobleman taking a morning stroll. As he was led toward the scaffold, he looked up and saw Frederick in the window. Their eyes met across the courtyard, a final silent communication across an impossible divide. What happened next is etched into the darkest annals of Prussian history. According to eyewitnesses, Katte called up to the window in French, the language they had so often shared in secret. Mon cher prince," he said, his voice clear and steady, "I die for you with a heart full of joy." From the window, a choked, agonized cry. Frederick, his voice breaking with a grief that seemed to tear itself from his soul, tried to reply. "My dear Katte," he sobbed, "1,000 pardons. Forgive me." Katte knelt, placing his head upon the block. He murmured a final prayer. The headsman stepped forward, the sword a glint of cold steel in the gray morning light. The guards tightened their grip. He could not look away, could not scream, only watch. The moment the blade fell, something inside Frederick broke. He let out a single guttural scream and fainted, slumping into the arms of his guards. The spectacle was over. The king's lesson had been delivered. When Frederick awoke, he was no longer the same person. He slipped into a violent fever, a delirium haunted by visions of his lover's death. For days, he hovered between life and death, his mind a maelstrom of guilt, grief, and horror. He would see Kata's face, hear his final words, and see the flash of the sword over and over again. The trauma was so severe that those attending him feared for his sanity, and indeed for his life. The boy who had entered that cell was gone, replaced by a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a man tormented by a memory that would never leave him. His father's reaction was devoid of any paternal compassion. He saw his son's breakdown not as a sign of profound trauma, but as further evidence of his weakness. When informed that Frederick was inconsolable, the king's only response was cold and pragmatic. He sent a chaplain to the fortress, not to comfort his son, but to lecture him, to force him to confess his sins, repent, and submit to the king's authority as God's chosen instrument on earth. Slowly, agonizingly, Frederick began to emerge from the depths of his grief, but it was not a recovery, it was a transformation. The fire of youthful idealism had been extinguished, quenched by a torrent of blood. In its place, a cold, hard pragmatism began to take root. He realized with the chilling clarity of a survivor that his emotions, his love, his very soul were vulnerabilities. To feel was to be weak. To love was to invite destruction. To survive in his father's world and to one day rule it, he would have to become like his father, ruthless, calculating, and emotionally detached. He began the slow, painful process of rebuilding himself, not as the man he wanted to be, but as the man he had to be. He swore an oath of absolute obedience to his father. He agreed to all the king's demands. He would study administration. He would learn the art of war. He would marry the woman his father chose for him. He would play the part of the dutiful son and heir. But it was all a performance, a meticulously constructed facade. Beneath the surface, the wound of Kata's death festered. It became the defining trauma of his existence, the dark lens through which he would view the world for the rest of his life. It bred in him a deep and abiding cynicism about human nature, a distrust of emotion, and a cold understanding of power. Power, he had learned in the most brutal way imaginable, was not about justice or reason. It was about the will to impose one's reality upon others. His father had imposed his reality on him, and it had cost Kata his life. Frederick would never forget that lesson. One day, he would be the one with the power, and he would never ever be vulnerable again. The scaffolding of a new soul was being erected, built from the timber of tragedy and cemented with the blood of a lost love. In the aftermath of the execution, Frederick's world was silent. The passionate, defiant prince was gone, buried with Kata in the cold ground of the fortress courtyard. In his place stood a quiet, obedient, and unnervingly composed young man. This was not healing. This was survival. He understood the rules of his father's game now, and he knew that to win, or even to live, he had to play it flawlessly. His period of imprisonment gave way to a carefully orchestrated rehabilitation. He was released from his cell but was ordered to remain in the town of Kustrin, assigned to the local War and Domains Chamber. It was a deliberate humiliation. The heir to the throne, a man who had corresponded with Europe's greatest minds, was now forced to learn the tedious minutiae of provincial bureaucracy. He was to learn how a state truly functioned, not from grand theories, but from the bottom up in grain prices, land deeds, and textile manufacturing. His father intended this as a final lesson in practicality, a way to purge the last remnants of French foolishness from his son's mind. And Frederick, with the chilling self-control of a man who had lost everything, complied. He did more than comply, he excelled. He applied his formidable intellect to the tasks at hand, mastering the complexities of Prussian administration with an efficiency that surprised and perhaps even unnerved his superiors. He was the perfect student, the model of a reformed son, but it was all an act. He was forging a new kind of armor, not of steel, but of competence and conformity. The final act of his submission was to be his marriage. Before the tragedy, Frederick had recoiled at the idea of a political union. Now he accepted it with a detached resignation. His father had chosen his bride, Elizabeth Christine, of Brunswick-Bevern, a German princess known for her beauty and quiet piety. She was a conventional choice, a perfectly suitable future queen. To Frederick, she was a stranger, a symbol of his complete and utter capitulation. He had no interest in her as a woman, as a partner, or as a person. He saw the marriage for what it was, a dynastic transaction and the price of his freedom. His sister Wilhelmina, who knew him better than anyone, described his attitude with brutal honesty. He told her plainly that he found his fiancée dull and uninteresting. He pitied her, he said, but he would do his duty. He would marry her, secure his position, and then live his life as he saw fit. Love, romance, intimacy, these were concepts that had died for him at Kustrin. He would never allow another person to hold that kind of power over him again. They were married on June 12, 1733. The wedding was a grand affair, a public spectacle designed to showcase the reconciliation of the king and his heir. For Frederick, it was a hollow performance. On their wedding night, he was famously polite, fulfilled his dynastic obligation, and then, for all intents and purposes, walked away. He would never live with her as a true husband. He installed her in her own separate palace and would visit her only on rare, formal occasions. They would have no children. He had given his father an heir-in-waiting and a daughter-in-law. He had paid his debt. The rest of his life, he decided, would be his own. His reward for this perfect obedience was a measure of freedom. His father, finally satisfied that his son had been broken and remade in a more acceptable image, granted him his own residence. He was given Rheinsberg, a small, elegant chateau in the countryside. And it was here, away from the suffocating gloom of his father's court, that Frederick began to live again. Rheinsberg became his sanctuary, his personal kingdom. With a renewed passion, he threw himself into transforming the modest castle into a masterpiece of Rococo architecture, a style his father detested. He filled it with art, built a magnificent library, and designed a music hall. Rheinsberg was not just a palace, it was an act of defiance, a carefully constructed paradise dedicated to everything the soldier king despised: beauty, intellect, and the free exchange of ideas. He gathered around him a circle of like-minded friends, his Rheinsberg circle. They were architects like Georg Wenceslaus von Knobelsdorff, artists like Antoine Pesne, and a host of musicians, poets, and freethinkers. It was a court of the muses, a haven for the Enlightenment in the heart of militaristic Prussia. Here, Frederick could finally shed his mask. He composed prolifically, sonatas, concertos, even his first symphonies. He spent his days in philosophical debate, his nights attending concerts and theatrical performances. He referred to these years as the happiest of his life, a brief idyllic interlude between the trauma of his youth and the crushing responsibilities that awaited him. It was also at Rheinsberg that he initiated one of the most famous intellectual friendships in history. He began a correspondence with the giant of the French Enlightenment, Voltaire. For Frederick, Voltaire was more than a writer. He was a hero, the living embodiment of reason and intellectual courage. Their letters, which would continue for over 40 years, were a dazzling exchange of ideas on philosophy, politics, religion, and art. In Voltaire, Frederick found a teacher, a sparring partner, and an intellectual equal who could challenge and inspire him in a way no one else could. But the philosopher of Rheinsberg had not forgotten the lessons of Cousterin. Even in this idyllic setting, a harder, more cynical worldview was taking shape. He wrote Anti-Machiavel, a philosophical treatise refuting the cynical, amoral politics of Machiavelli's The Prince. In it, he argued for a model of enlightened, virtuous kingship, where the ruler is the first servant of the state, bound by justice and reason. It was a noble vision, a blueprint for the kind of king he hoped to be. Yet even as he wrote it, he was studying the art of war and observing the brutal realities of European power politics. The man who argued against Machiavelli was simultaneously learning everything he could from him. He understood that to protect his beloved Rheinsberg, to create a state where art and philosophy could flourish, he would need to be strong, cunning, and, when necessary, utterly ruthless. This was the great paradox of Frederick's life in waiting. He was living a double existence. At Rheinsberg, he was the philosopher prince, the sensitive artist, the man he was always meant to be. But whenever he was summoned to his father's court in Potsdam, the mask would go back on. He would become the dutiful son, the obedient soldier, discussing troop movements and crop yields with a convincing seriousness. He was playing a long game, biding his time, waiting for the inevitable. As the 1730s drew to a close, the soldier king's health began to fail. The titan who had terrorized Frederick's youth was now a frail, ailing man. There was a fragile deathbed reconciliation between them, a final truce in a lifelong war, but the damage was done. On May 31st, 1740, Frederick William I died. At the age of 28, Frederick was now king of Prussia. The idyllic years at Rheinsberg were over. The power he had both craved and dreaded was now his. The entire continent watched, wondering what kind of king this mysterious young man would be. Would it be the enlightened author of Anti-Machiavel, the man who had championed reason and virtue, or would it be the hardened survivor of Cousterin, the cynical student of power who had learned his lessons in a courtyard stained with his lover's blood? The world would not have to wait long to find out. On May 31st, 1740, Frederick became King Frederick II of Prussia. A wave of excitement and anticipation swept not just through Prussia, but across the intellectual capitals of Europe. The philosopher was finally on the throne. The man who had corresponded with Voltaire, who had written the noble Anti-Machiavel, who had championed reason and justice, was now in power. The dark, oppressive era of the soldier king was over. A new age of Prussian enlightenment, it seemed, was about to dawn. And in his first few months, Frederick played the part to perfection. His initial actions were everything the philosophers had dreamed of. He declared that the king was the first servant of the state, a radical idea in an age of divine right absolutism. He abolished the use of judicial torture, a barbaric practice common throughout Europe. He promoted religious tolerance, famously stating that in his kingdom all religions must be tolerated, for here every man must get to heaven in his own way. He encouraged freedom of the press, ordering the censors to be less restrictive. He walked the streets of Berlin with little escort, engaging with his subjects directly. It was a stunning performance. The courts of Europe watched in awe. Voltaire rejoiced. It seemed that the dream of a true philosopher king had finally been realized. But behind this enlightened facade, the hardened survivor of Cousterin was watching, waiting, and calculating. He had spent years studying the mechanisms of power, not just from books, but from the brutal lessons of his own life. He had inherited from his father not just a crown, but two invaluable assets, a full treasury and the most disciplined, formidable army in Europe. While the world saw a philosopher, Frederick saw his moment approaching. He was a predator, cloaked in the robes of a poet, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment arrived just 5 months into his reign. In October 1740, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VI of the House of Habsburg, died without a male heir. This was not an unforeseen event. For years, Charles had poured all his diplomatic energy into securing an agreement known as the Pragmatic Sanction, which was meant to guarantee that his vast, sprawling domains, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and parts of Italy, could be inherited by his eldest daughter, a spirited and intelligent 23-year-old named Maria Theresa. Nearly every major power in Europe, including Prussia, had agreed to the Pragmatic Sanction. It was a signed, sealed treaty, a matter of international law and royal honor. But to Frederick, a treaty was merely a piece of paper, and honor was a luxury for those who could afford it. He saw the situation not through the lens of law, but through the cold, hard lens of opportunity. The Habsburgs were ancient and powerful, but their treasury was empty, their army was disorganized, and their new ruler was a young woman whom many of his rivals believed was unfit to rule. He saw weakness, and where he saw weakness, he saw a prize. The prize was Silesia, a rich, populous, and strategically vital province belonging to the Habsburgs, lying just to the south of Prussia. Its acquisition would transform Prussia overnight, doubling its population and adding immense industrial and agricultural wealth. The legal pretext for an invasion was flimsy, based on a centuries-old dubious dynastic claim that his ancestors had long since abandoned. But Frederick didn't care about pretexts. He cared about results. He convened a secret council with his most trusted ministers. They were horrified. They advised caution. They warned of the diplomatic fallout. They spoke of the dishonor of breaking a solemn treaty. To attack the young Maria Theresa would be an act of unprovoked, predatory aggression. It was the very definition of Machiavellian politics, the kind of cynical power grab he had so eloquently condemned in his own book. But the old men were arguing with a ghost. They were speaking to the philosopher of Rheinsberg, but the man standing before them was the survivor of Küstrin. He had learned his lesson from his father not in a classroom, but in a prison cell. Power respects only power. Vulnerability is an invitation to destruction. He would not be the victim ever again. He dismissed his minister's concerns with a chilling statement. I have my troops, and they are ready. If I do not use them now, I will not be able to do so when I need them most. The moment has arrived to make a name for oneself. The decision was made. On December 16, 1740, without a declaration of war, 30,000 Prussian soldiers crossed the border into Silesia. Europe was stunned. The sheer audacity, the cynical opportunism of the act sent shock waves through every court on the continent. The author of Anti-Machiavel had revealed himself to be its most devoted student. Frederick had thrown off his philosopher's mask, and beneath it was the face of a conqueror. The initial invasion was more of a parade than a war. The unprepared Austrian garrisons offered little resistance. But Maria Theresa, despite being underestimated by Frederick, was a woman of iron will. She would not surrender her birthright. She rallied her allies, and the conflict soon exploded into a continent-wide struggle, the War of the Austrian Succession. Frederick, the philosopher, who had never seen a real battle, now had to lead his army. His first major test came at the Battle of Mollwitz in April 1741, and it was a near disaster. When the Austrian cavalry charged, Frederick, convinced the battle was lost, panicked. He turned and fled the battlefield, a humiliating flight that nearly cost him his crown. But an amazing thing happened. While their king was galloping away in terror, his infantry, the perfectly drilled machine created by his father, stood its ground. Under the command of the veteran Field Marshal Schwerin, the Prussian infantry methodically destroyed the Austrian army. Frederick learned of his own victory miles away while in hiding. The experience was deeply shameful, but it was also transformative. It taught him two crucial lessons. First, that his father's army was indeed the magnificent instrument he had believed it to be. And second, that he himself had to master the brutal art of war. He could not rely on others. He had to become the cold, calculating commander his army deserved. He never fled a battlefield again. The terror of Mollwitz burned away the last traces of the amateur, and in its place, a true military commander began to form. He had gambled everything on a single cynical act of aggression, and through a combination of his father's legacy and his own brutal determination, he was winning. The warrior had been born. The War of the Austrian Succession raged across Europe for nearly 8 years, but Frederick, having seized his prize, played a cynical and brilliant game. He fought when he had to, securing his claim to Silesia with bloody victories at Hohenfriedberg and Sur. But he also signed separate peace treaties when it suited him, abandoning his allies without a second thought, leaving them to fight on while he consolidated his gains. By the time the General Peace Treaty was signed in 1748, the outcome was undeniable. Prussia, the upstart kingdom, had successfully stolen a major province from the ancient House of Habsburg. Frederick had gambled, and he had won, but he had also paid a price. The young, seemingly enlightened king was now seen for what he was, an opportunist, a treaty breaker, and a dangerous predator on the world stage. He had made a permanent, implacable enemy of Maria Theresa, who would spend the next decade consumed by a single desire to reclaim Silesia and punish the man she called the evil man. Frederick had gained a province, but he had lost his reputation and secured the enmity of an empress. He knew the peace he had won was not a permanent state. It was merely an intermission. With the war over and Silesia secured, Frederick turned his energies inward. The philosopher king, so long suppressed by the warrior, now re-emerged with a vengeance. Just outside Potsdam, on a gentle terraced hill, he created his masterpiece, the palace he named Sans Souci, without a care. The name itself was a profound statement. It was to be his sanctuary, his escape from the cares of state, the pressures of kingship, and the ghosts of his past. Sans Souci was unlike any other royal palace in Europe. It was not designed to project overwhelming power and grandeur like Versailles. It was intimate, personal, almost modest. It was a retreat built for a man, not for a monarchy. Here, Frederick could live not as a king, but as a private gentleman. He designed much of it himself, insisting on a single-story layout, so that he could walk directly from his rooms into his gardens without the hassle of stairs. It was a place built for music, for conversation, and for contemplation. And the life he created at Sans Souci was as unique as the palace itself. His wife, Queen Elizabeth Christine, was politely but firmly barred. She was installed in her own separate palace and was rarely, if ever, invited to Frederick's private retreat. Sans Souci was an exclusively male world. His guests, his companions, his friends, they were all men. Artists, musicians, scientists, philosophers, and a handful of trusted military officers. They were his band of brothers, an intellectual circle that recreated the idyllic camaraderie of his Rheinsberg years. They would spend their days in intellectual pursuit. In the evenings, Frederick would host concerts, performing his own compositions on the flute. Afterwards, they would gather around his famous circular table for dinner and conversation that lasted late into the night. Here, Frederick insisted on an atmosphere of intellectual equality. His guests were encouraged to speak freely, to debate, to argue, to be witty, but everyone knew the truth. It was equality by the king's permission. He was always the sun around which all these other brilliant minds orbited. To complete this perfect intellectual paradise, Frederick needed one final glittering prize: Voltaire himself. For years he had courted the great French philosopher, showering him with praise, sending him generous gifts, and begging him to come and live at his court. Voltaire, who was often in trouble with the French authorities for his radical ideas, was tempted by the offer of a safe haven and the patronage of a king who adored him. In 1750, he finally accepted. His arrival in Prussia was a sensation. The greatest king of the age and the greatest philosopher of the age were now united. It seemed like the culmination of the Enlightenment dream. Frederick gave Voltaire lavish apartments at Souci, a generous pension, and the prestigious title of Royal Chamberlain. Their initial months together were a dazzling honeymoon of the mind. They would dine together, edit each other's writing, and engage in brilliant, witty conversations that electrified the court. Frederick was ecstatic. He had captured his hero. But the dream was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. Voltaire had come seeking a partnership of equals, a true republic of letters. Frederick, however, wanted a brilliant courtier, the most magnificent intellectual ornament in Europe, but an ornament nonetheless. The king who demanded absolute obedience on the battlefield was not suited for a friendship with a man who bowed to no authority but his own intellect. The cracks began to show almost immediately. Voltaire, a shrewd and sometimes unscrupulous businessman, got involved in a shady financial lawsuit with a Berlin moneylender, a scandal that embarrassed the king. Worse, he became embroiled in a bitter public feud with the president of Frederick's own Royal Academy, a man named Maupertuis. Voltaire, the master of satire, published a vicious, wickedly funny pamphlet that utterly destroyed Maupertuis' reputation. For Frederick, this was the ultimate betrayal. Voltaire had not only mocked a man under the king's protection, but he had made the Prussian court a laughingstock across Europe. It was a direct challenge to his authority, an act of unforgivable insubordination. He ordered all copies of the pamphlet to be seized and publicly burned by the executioner. The friendship was shattered beyond repair. The philosopher king had shown his true colors. He was a king first and a philosopher second. He summoned Voltaire for a final stormy meeting. The man he had once idolized was now just another disobedient subject. Voltaire knew he had to leave. In the spring of 1753, he fled Prussia, but Frederick's vengeance was not yet complete. When Voltaire and his traveling party reached the free city of Frankfurt, they were intercepted by Prussian agents on Frederick's orders. They were detained, held under house arrest for over a month, their belongings searched, their money confiscated. It was a petty, thuggish, and deeply humiliating act. The enlightened monarch had used the brute force of the state to bully and intimidate his former friend. It was a final bitter lesson for both men. For Voltaire, it was proof that even the most philosophical king was at heart a tyrant. For Frederick, it was a painful reminder of the lesson from his youth. Even the deepest intellectual bonds were fragile and subject to the brutal realities of power. Voltaire was eventually released, and the two would later resume a cautious, long-distance correspondence, their wit sharpened by a new layer of mutual resentment. But the dream was dead. The brightest star of Souci was gone. Frederick was left in his perfect palace, surrounded by his loyal companions, his music, and his beloved greyhounds. He had created a world without a care, but he was more isolated than ever. He was the absolute master of his own small universe, but also its sole prisoner. And beyond the peaceful gardens of his sanctuary, the storm clouds were gathering once more. His enemies had not forgotten him, and the 7 years of peace were about to give way to 7 years of unimaginable war. The decade of peace had been an illusion, a fragile ceasefire in a war of hearts that had never truly ended. In Vienna, Empress Maria Theresa had not spent the years in quiet resignation. She had been waiting, planning, and seething. The loss of her beloved Silesia was a wound that would not heal, and the man who had inflicted it was a villain she was determined to crush. She found her instrument of revenge in a brilliant and wily diplomat, Prince von Kaunitz. Kaunitz engineered a political earthquake that came to be known as the Diplomatic Revolution. For centuries, the map of European alliances had been defined by one central conflict: the French House of Bourbon against the Austrian House of Habsburg. Kaunitz, with breathtaking skill, turned this history on its head. He convinced the French court at Versailles that the real threat to their power was not their old rival Austria, but the ambitious, unpredictable, and rapidly rising upstart Prussia. He then brought Russia, ruled by Empress Elizabeth, who personally detested Frederick, into the fold. A monstrous coalition was formed. Austria, France, and Russia, three of the greatest land powers on the continent, were now allied, united by a common goal: the annihilation of Frederick the Great and the dismemberment of his kingdom. Frederick, watching from his sanctuary at Souci, was not blind to the danger. His spies brought him reports of the secret treaties being signed, of the armies being mobilized. He was surrounded, isolated, and massively outnumbered. His only significant ally was Great Britain, a great naval power, but one that could offer little help on the continent. The numbers were staggering. The coalition could field armies totaling nearly 500,000 men. Prussia, even with its famed military, could barely muster a third of that. For any rational observer, the situation was hopeless. Prussia was doomed. But Frederick was not a rational observer in the conventional sense. He was a survivor, a gambler, a predator. He had learned from his father that the best defense was a good offense. He knew that if he waited for this juggernaut of an alliance to coordinate its attack, he would be crushed. His only hope, his only chance at survival, was to strike first, to move with lightning speed, disrupt their plans, and knock one of his enemies out of the war before the others could fully mobilize. It was the Silesian gambit all over again, but this time the stakes were not a single province, but his entire kingdom, his legacy, and his life. In August 1756, Frederick launched his preemptive strike. He invaded the neighboring electorate of Saxony, a neutral state that he correctly suspected was secretly part of the alliance against him. He stormed its capital, Dresden, seized its treasury, and forcibly incorporated the entire Saxon army into his own. Europe was once again aghast at his ruthlessness, but for Frederick, it was a simple, brutal calculation of survival. He had gained resources and a strategic buffer zone, but he had also triggered the tripwire. The 7 Years' War, a conflict that would stretch from the forests of Germany to the plains of India and the wilderness of North America, had begun. The first year of the war was a brutal slog. Frederick won a costly victory in Bohemia, but was then driven back. His enemies began to close in. The French advanced from the west. A combined army of imperial states moved in from the south. The Austrians regrouped and the massive Russian army began its slow, inexorable advance from the east. By the autumn of 1757, Frederick's situation was desperate. His kingdom was being invaded from all sides. His enemies were closing in for the kill. It was in this darkest hour that he would forge his legend. On November 5th, 1757, near the village of Rossbach, Frederick confronted a combined French and Imperial army more than double his size. The Allied commander, confident in his numbers, decided to march around Frederick's flank to cut off his retreat. It was a textbook maneuver, but it was slow and clumsy. Frederick, watching from a rooftop, saw his opportunity. Under the cover of low hills, he moved his own army with breathtaking speed. The Allies thought he was retreating. Instead, he was racing to attack the head of their marching column. Suddenly, from behind the ridgeline, the Prussian cavalry, led by the brilliant General von Seydlitz, exploded onto the exposed flank of the Allied army. At the same time, the Prussian artillery opened a devastating fire, followed by the machine-like advance of the Prussian infantry. The Allied army, caught completely by surprise and still in its marching formation, dissolved into chaos. In less than 90 minutes, the battle was over. Frederick had lost fewer than 600 men. The Allies had lost 10,000. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory, a masterpiece of speed, discipline, and deception. But there was no time to celebrate. Word arrived that the Austrians had invaded Silesia and captured a huge portion of his army. Leaving a token force behind, Frederick force-marched his victorious troops over 170 miles in just 12 days, a logistical feat that exhausted his men, but brought them to Silesia just in time. Exactly 1 month after Rossbach, on December 5th, 1757, near the village of Leuthen, he faced an Austrian army of 66,000 men. He had only 36,000. It was here that he delivered the greatest tactical masterpiece of his career. He advanced on the Austrian lines, but feinted an attack on their right wing. The Austrian commander took the bait, shifting his reserves to meet the threat. But this was exactly what Frederick wanted. Hidden by a range of hills, he marched the main body of his army in the opposite direction, completely concealed from the enemy. He wheeled around the Austrian left flank, which the Austrians had weakened, and smashed into it with overwhelming force, rolling up their entire battle line from the side. It was a tactic that would be studied by generals for centuries. The Austrians were routed. Silesia was saved. Rossbach and Leuthen, two of the most decisive victories in military history, were won within a single month. Frederick was hailed as the greatest military genius of his age. But genius was not enough to win the war. The victories were spectacular, but his enemies' resources were nearly limitless. For every army he destroyed, they raised another. The war became a relentless, grinding nightmare. Prussia was bled white. The Russians proved to be his most fearsome foe. In 1759, at the Battle of Kunersdorf, Frederick suffered the most catastrophic defeat of his life. His army was annihilated by a combined Austro-Russian force. He had 2 horses shot out from under him, and a golden snuff box in his coat pocket deflected a bullet that would have killed him. In the aftermath, he fell into a black despair. He believed all was lost. In a letter written that night, he handed over command of the army and essentially wrote his own political testament. "I have no resources left," he wrote, "and to tell the truth, I believe all is lost. I will not survive the ruin of my country. Farewell forever." He was ready for suicide. He carried a small vial of poison with him at all times, a final escape from the humiliation of capture. But he did not give up. With a will of pure iron, he scraped together the remnants of his army and fought on. The next few years were a living hell. His beloved sister Wilhelmina died, a personal blow that devastated him. His capital, Berlin, was briefly occupied by his enemies. His kingdom was ravaged. His treasury was empty. His soldiers were exhausted. He was no longer Frederick the Great, the brilliant conqueror. He was old Fritz, a grizzled, weary survivor, holding on by a thread, his face etched with the grief and exhaustion of a man who had seen too much death. He was losing, and he knew it. Then, when all hope seemed gone, fate intervened in the most dramatic way imaginable. On January 5th, 1762, his most implacable enemy, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, died. Her successor was her nephew, Tsar Peter III, and Peter was a fanatical, almost childlike, admirer of Frederick the Great. He idolized the Prussian king. His first act as Tsar was to pull Russia out of the war immediately. This was not all. He then signed a peace treaty, returned all captured territory, and offered to ally his army with Frederick's. It was a complete, stunning 180-degree reversal of policy. It was so improbable, so miraculous, that it has gone down in history as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. His greatest enemy had become his greatest ally overnight. The ring of steel had been broken. With Russia out of the war, the coalition crumbled. Austria and France, exhausted and bankrupt, could not continue the fight alone. In 1763, the Treaty of Hubertusburg was signed, ending the war. The terms were simple. The borders would return to what they were before the war began. After 7 years of unimaginable bloodshed, after hundreds of thousands of deaths, nothing had changed territorially. But everything had changed. Frederick kept Silesia. Prussia had survived. Against all odds, the small kingdom had faced down the 3 greatest powers on the continent and had not been broken. Frederick had been to the abyss and returned. He was no longer just a king, he was a legend. The dashing philosopher king was gone, replaced by a figure his people would come to know, with a mixture of awe and affection, as der alte Fritz, old Fritz. The war had saved his kingdom, but it had irrevocably broken his health and consumed the last vestiges of his youthful spirit. He returned to his capital not as a triumphant conqueror demanding adulation, but as a grim, weary father returning to a ruined home, knowing the immense task of rebuilding lay ahead. The next 23 years of his reign would be a long, laborious autumn. He would never again lead an army into a major battle. The gambler had made his final throw and survived. Now, he would dedicate the rest of his life to consolidating his gains and healing his shattered kingdom. He approached the task of reconstruction with the same ferocious, obsessive energy he had once devoted to war. He famously declared, "It is not necessary that I should live, but it is necessary that I should act." His Prussia was devastated. Huge swathes of the countryside were depopulated, farms lay fallow, and the economy was in ruins. Frederick became the ultimate enlightened despot, a micromanager of national recovery. He poured state funds into rebuilding towns and villages. He distributed grain to starving peasants and gave them horses from the army's cavalry to plow their fields. He spearheaded massive infrastructure projects, draining swamps to create new farmland, and settling hundreds of thousands of immigrants to repopulate his kingdom. He also became famously the Potato King. Knowing the hardy, nutritious tuber could prevent the famines that so often plagued his people, he ordered his peasants to cultivate it. They refused, suspicious of the strange new crop. So Frederick, the master of psychology, employed a brilliant piece of reverse psychology. He had a royal potato patch planted at Souci and ordered it to be heavily guarded by his soldiers, but with secret instructions to be lax in their duties. The local peasants, assuming that anything so well guarded must be incredibly valuable, began sneaking in at night to steal the potatoes and plant them in their own fields. The trick worked. The potato became a staple of the German diet, saving countless lives in the generations to come. He pushed forward with his legal reforms, initiating the codification of a single, rational body of law for all his territories. He continued to champion religious tolerance, welcoming persecuted groups like the Huguenots, though his tolerance often had a pragmatic edge and famously did not extend equally to Jews, whom he burdened with special taxes and restrictions. He was a man of profound contradictions, the enlightened ruler who believed in reason and order, but also the absolute monarch who would tolerate no dissent and whose primary goal was always the strength and security of his state, not the liberty of his subjects. But as he rebuilt his kingdom, his own personal world grew smaller and more isolated. He retreated almost entirely to the hermetic world of Souci. The vibrant intellectual circle of his younger years faded away. Many of his old friends had died during the war. He grew increasingly misanthropic, his wit curdling into a biting sarcasm, his temperament famously grumpy. He had seen the worst of humanity, and it had left him with a deep and abiding contempt for what he called this damned human race. His only true and constant companions were his dogs, a pack of Italian greyhounds that he adored with a tenderness he showed to no human being. They slept in his bed, ate from his plate, and were his constant shadows. He gave them French names like Biche and Alcman, and referred to them as his little marquises. This profound affection for his dogs was a heartbreaking window into his soul. After the ultimate betrayal of his youth, after the cynical maneuverings of kings and the turbulence of his friendship with Voltaire, dogs offered what humans could not: absolute, unquestioning loyalty. They were the only creatures he felt he could truly love without fear of pain or betrayal. In his final years, he was a lonely figure, rising before dawn to begin a relentless schedule of state business that ended late at night. He ate enormous, heavily spiced meals and consumed vast quantities of coffee to keep himself going. His health, shattered by the campaigns of the 7 Years' War, declined steadily. He suffered from gout, digestive ailments, and a host of other maladies, but he refused to be properly cared for, berating his doctors and stubbornly clinging to his destructive habits. It was a final act of control from a man who had controlled everything in his life except his own heart. In the summer of 1786, it was clear the end was near. He became so bloated with fluid that he could no longer lie down, and spent his final weeks sleeping in an armchair. On the morning of August 17, 1786, at the age of 74, old Fritz died quietly in his chair at Souci. There was no family by his side. His estranged wife was not present. His heir, a nephew he despised, was waiting in the wings. His only faithful companions, his dogs, were in the room with him. His final wishes were simple and clear. He wanted a quiet nighttime funeral with no pomp or ceremony, and he wanted to be buried on the terrace at Souci, next to his beloved greyhounds. It was the final poignant request of a man who had felt more at home with his animals than with his own species. But his nephew, the new king, ignored his wishes. Seeing it as beneath the dignity of a great king, he had Frederick interred in the garrison church at Potsdam, next to the tyrannical father he had loathed. It was one final posthumous act of defiance against his will. It was not until 1991, after the reunification of Germany, that Frederick's coffin was finally moved and his last wish was granted. He was laid to rest in his garden, beside his beloved dogs. History calls him Frederick the Great, the conqueror of Silesia, the philosopher king who forged Prussia into a great power. Yet beneath the marble and the myth was a man haunted forever by one memory. The day Kata died before his eyes did not just kill his lover, it killed the part of him that could ever love again. The rest of his life was a long act of revenge against emotion itself. He ruled with brilliance, but also with ice in his veins. He trusted no one, loved no one, and found his only peace in the quiet company of his dogs. When he died, they buried him beside the father he despised. 2 centuries later, his body was finally brought home to Souci to rest among the gardens and the greyhounds that had loved him without judgment. It was a simple ending for a man who conquered half of Europe but never conquered himself, because Frederick the Great, the king, the legend, was always, until his final breath, the same boy who once stood at a prison window and watched his heart fall beneath the executioner's blade.